Mr. Baldwin, hold up your right hand. Do you swear that the evidence that you shall give to the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but truth, so help you God?
I do. A meeting was held at the United States District Courthouse on the morning of 7/5/72, at which time it was represented to us by the government that Baldwin would not be a defendant in the Watergate matter if he cooperated. The government attorney stated that if they were satisfied with Baldwin's information, he would not be indicted. I'm still relying on that promise today as I testify here, and from the very beginning of my decision to cooperate on June 25th to now, I have attempted to tell the whole truth of this incident to the government. I do not regret this decision, although my life was that time shattered. I cannot now find employment, and I have been without funds. My family has been disgraced. I believe that since I was working for the former Attorney General and White House officials, I would not question to do what I was asked to do. Now I regret only that decision. Regardless of this, I shall now follow through with my commitment to tell the government and the American people the truth.
I'd like to defer present time, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I will waive.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Weicker has had an opportunity to interview with this witness on more than one occasion. He's from Connecticut, and I'd recommend, if we may, that we defer to him at the outset.
I certainly agree with you. That'd be advisable course.
Thanks, Senator Baker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Mr. Baldwin, on May 1st, 1972, you were contacted by James McCord with regard to employment. Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator.
When Mr. McCord called you, did he say how he had obtained your name?
I don't recall if it was during the first conversation or the subsequent conversation the following day, but he told me that he had obtained my resume from the Society of Ex-FBI Agents in New York City.
And did he describe the work that he wanted you to do?
On the initial phone call, he didn't go into explicit details. He said it was a matter of urgency, that if it was possible to come to Washington where he would like to interview me. But he did basically inform me that it would involve security work for the committee to re-elect the president, and at that particular time in specific some services with Mrs. Martha Mitchell, the wife of the Attorney General.
Now, when you entered room 419 on May the 26th, what did you see?
When I entered the room, there was numerous items of electronic equipment in the room. When I entered the room, it was approximately 2 p.m. in the afternoon, I believe, about that hour. And Mr. McCord was in the room and operating one of the receiver units. At that time, I didn't know what it was. He explained it.
In other words, this was the first time that you had seen electronic equipment in room 419 of the Howard Johnsons.
This particular piece of equipment that he was working on, that was the first time I had seen that. On the couch, there was a piece of electronic equipment which was contained in a briefcase that had been described to me, that I had previously seen at the committee to re-elect the president headquarters. This was called a debugger and a monitoring unit.
In other words, you'd seen a portion of the equipment.
A portion I had seen previous.
At the committee to re-elect the president.
That's correct. But the equipment that he was working on when I entered the room, I had never seen that before.
And as you entered the room, Mr. McCord was in the process of what? Experimenting with his equipment? What did he indicate to you at the time that you entered the room?
He was tuning the equipment. The unit was operating, and he was working the tuning dials. There are several tuning dials on the piece of equipment.
Did you have any questions of him as to exactly what was going on at that time?
No, I had just driven approximately 6 hours, and he said, as soon as you get unpacked and relaxed, I'll explain this. And I said, all right, I'll take a shower and shave and join you.
Now, Mr. Baldwin, was there a sequence of events leading up to a visit by other persons to the room that afternoon?
Well, I was told that some other individuals would be coming to the room that were part of the security force, and that in view of their position, they would be introduced under aliases to me, and that I would also be introduced. And Mr. McCord said, don't take this personal. It's no reflection on you, but because of the nature of the work we're involved in, I'm going to use an alias for you, and I'll use an alias for them. I'll be introducing him as...
What was the alias that he gave to you?
He asked me to use the alias of Bill Johnson, the alias I had used calling in on my reports while on the surveillance operation. It was the same alias I had used.
All right, then would you continue your narrative to the committee as to what happened that afternoon?
Two individuals came to the room, and when they entered the room, Mr. McCord turned to me, and at this point, he said, Al, I'd like you to meet, and I believe he said, Ed, and he got all confused because he hadn't used the alias.
He hadn't used the alias which you were supposed to use in your conversation.
That's correct. And he was introducing him, I don't know if he said at that point Ed Gordon or how he did it, but he had a retrack, and then he tried to introduce me under my alias, and he couldn't remember it, and then he just introduced us under first names.
Right. Now, subsequently, have you identified who those two men were that came into the room?
That's correct. In the FBI photographic display, they were identified as Mr. Liddy and Mr. Hunt.
Now, that same evening of May the 26th, was there a trip to McGovern headquarters?
That's correct, there was.
Would you describe to the committee that trip and the evening's activity at McGovern headquarters?
Well, the purpose of my returning from Connecticut was to work that weekend. Mr. McCord advised me that there would be, we would have to work that weekend. I didn't know we were going to McGovern headquarters until we arrived at the scene. Prior to arriving there, we stopped. He had to buy some batteries. He sent me in to buy them. And then we proceeded to McGovern headquarters, and as we drove by the headquarters, he pointed to a building and he said, this is what we're interested in. We've got to meet some other people here. And then he proceeded to explain that we have to find our individual. One of our men is here. It will be in a yellow Volkswagen. Keep your eyes open for the Volkswagen and for the man sitting in it. I think he even mentioned boy. I don't think he said man. There's a boy in the Volkswagen. He said we have one of our people is inside the headquarters. The problem was that there was an individual standing outside of McGovern's headquarters, which was a second store headquarters above, and I believe they were stores. There was a chain across them. And this individual was there. This was late in the evening, approximately 1 or 2 o'clock in the early morning hours, and Mr. McCord was quite upset the fact this individual was standing in front of the store. He had no business being there, according to Mr. McCord, or he shouldn't have been there.
Did you meet any other individuals at that particular address?
That's correct. Mr. McCord had been in communication over a walkie-talkie unit with some other individuals, and at one point, as we proceeded on the same street that the McGovern headquarters is located on, we stopped adjacent to a light-colored car. Individual alighted from the car and came into the front seat of Mr. McCord's car. I slid over, so I was between Mr. McCord and this individual.
Can you tell me who that individual was?
It was Mr. Liddy.
And did you succeed in getting into the McGovern headquarters on that evening?
No, they drove around. Mr. McCord and Mr. Liddy did all the talking, and they drove around. I don't know the exact length of time, but it was over a half hour. As a matter of fact, we drove up the alleyway adjacent to the buildings. They discussed the problem of lights. There was a discussion of whether or not their man was still inside. There was several discussions, and finally, Mr. Liddy said that we'll abort the mission. That was his terms.
Now, Mr. Baldwin, what was your primary job then during the first 2 weeks of June? We've now moved from the end of May to June. What was your primary job during that period of time?
I was instructed to monitor all telephone conversations that were being received over these units that were in the Howard Johnson room, and to make a log of all units.
With reference to overheard telephone conversations and excluding anything to do with personal lives of those who were overheard, can you tell the committee the content of any conversations of a political nature?
I'm afraid we made a mistake when we passed the Omnibus Crime Act. It may be illegal to bring out...
I believe
yes. Anything about the contents. I think maybe we were very foolish when Congress passed that law, but I believe it is the law.
Well, I would decline to answer that respectfully, Senator, based on 18 Section 2515, prohibition of use of evidence of intercepted wire or oral communication, which specifically states under this federal statute that if I divulge those contents, I'm subject to possible prosecution.
Yeah. On reflection, I think we were very foolish when we passed a law like that, but apparently it is.
About how many calls did you monitor?
Approximately 200.
Will you describe how you recorded these?
Initially, the first day, it was on a yellow legal pad. Mr. McCord took the actual longhand copy that I had made. Subsequently, he returned to the room, I believe it was on Labor Day Monday, with a electric typewriter. He asked me to transcribe my notes into typewritten form, making up duplicate copies, an original and an onion skin, and that's what I proceeded to do.
And then who would you transmit those logs to? Mr. McCord?
Mr. McCord received both the original and onion skin, that's correct.
At any time, did you hand those logs to an individual other than Mr. McCord?
The one incident where I was telephoned from Miami and told to deliver the logs to the Republican headquarters, the Committee to Re-elect the President on Pennsylvania Avenue, which I did.
Now, during these first 2 weeks in June, did you engage in any other activities? Specifically, did you go over to the Democratic National Committee?
That's correct, I did.
Would you describe that particular incident?
Mr. McCord appeared in the room on Monday, I believe it was the 12th of June, and advised me that, well, he furnished me a $100 bill and said, you're really going to have a ball this week. You're going to go over to the restaurant. I want you to hang around in the cocktail lounge of the restaurant, do visual surveillances of anybody from the Democratic headquarters. I would also like you to, he gave me a pretext to take a tour of the Democratic headquarters. I didn't agree with his approach, and I asked him if I could do it a different way. I followed that way, and I was given a tour of the Democratic headquarters that day.
Prior to the weekend of June 16th, did Mr. McCord discuss the plans for the rest of that weekend and any subsequent plans? In other words, what was the schedule of events for the weekend of June the 16th?
Well, after the tour, Senator, of the Mcgovern headquarters, it was obvious that Mr. Lawrence O'Brien was not in the Washington area, and that he had been in Miami and had been working in Miami. So
may I ask you this question, Mr. Baldwin? Do you mean the Mcgovern headquarters or the Democratic National?
I'm talking about the Democratic National Committee headquarters. After my tour there, part of the information I received was the fact that Mr. O'Brien had not been in Washington for the past month or so or longer. He had been in Miami. And Mr. McCord was quite pleased to hear this. And it appeared to me that it called for a rescheduling of the timetable, because he got quite upset to the fact that he would try to make some arrangements for me to go to Miami. He had already discussed with me the fact that I would be going to both the Democratic and the Republican conventions. But in view of this information that Mr. O'Brien was in Miami, this seemed to change his timetable, and he, for the rest of that week, at several different points, told me he would like to get my identification sewed up and get me down to Miami. He had to confer with some other individuals regarding this, and as soon as it was approved, I would be going to Miami.
All right. Now, on June the 16th, at around 4:30 p.m., did Mr. McCord appear in the room at the Watergate?
Yes.
I beg your pardon, in the room at the Howard Johnson's?
Yes, he appeared at Howard Johnson.
And what were your activities and his activities between 4:30 in the afternoon and 10 o'clock in the evening?
Do you want every detail, Senator?
I'd like you to tell in a broad narrative sense the committee as to what occurred.
Well, he gave me several instructions to buy some items for him, which I did. I tried to obtain some batteries, some regular flashlight batteries, and some what he called speaker wire, which is regular wire. I couldn't get the wire, so subsequently he left the room and went out. Part of the activities, he tested some type of a device on the phone, He tested a freestanding device next to the television. It had on a fire alarm unit, I believe. So and he had me soldering some batteries together during the course of that time. He made phone call, I believe, received 1 or 2 phone calls in the room. It was that general activity up to the point where he decided the difficulty was there was a gentleman working in the Democratic National Committee.
Did you know at that time that he had planned to go into Democratic National?
No, not until he was on the phone at one point, and he said, we still can't go over there because there's somebody working. And then I looked across and there was somebody working in the Democratic headquarters. He then told me, we don't know whether we're going to abort. Approximately a half hour or so later, this individual left, and the decision was made to go across the street.
At 10 p.m. then, is it your contention that Mr. McCord left the room?
I don't know the exact time. Oh, no, he left the room later than 10 p.m. You mean to go to the Democratic headquarters? Mm-hmm. He left at one point to buy some equipment at a radio discount store or someplace, and he returned. Then subsequent to that, he again went across. Then he left to go to across the street to the Democratic National Committee.
Did he give you any instructions as to what your role would be on that particular evening?
The only instructions that I received was just prior to him leaving, he removed a walkie-talkie unit. I believe it hooked onto his belt, or he had it inside a belt loop. He put it on the table next to the television set, and he said, I'm going across the street. We've got some people over there. I want you to watch. If you see anything at all, any activity, get on this unit and let us know. That was it. He didn't tell me any type of a radio call to use. He didn't tell me any type of code name. That was the sum extent of his instructions.
In other words, would it be safe to say that he asked you to report over the walkie-talkie any unusual activity, but without specifying what it was that he was going to do, or what
he just said any
operation
activity
in the Watergate was going to be?
He said any activity anything you see, any activity across the street, you just get on this unit and let us know. And he walked out of the room.
All right, now, Mr. Baldwin, in your own, again, narrative way, why don't you describe to the committee your role and also what you observed in the early morning hours of June the 17th?
The first thing I observed was while I was on the balcony, just standing on the balcony. It was a beautiful night, and I was out there.
Is this balcony, Mr. Baldwin, as we take a look at the chart, or the picture, this balcony is on the 7th floor?
Room 723, that's correct.
Of the Howard Johnson's Motel?
That's correct.
Please continue.
And I observed there was a guard standing in front of the building at 2600 directly across the Watergate complex. And I was watching this individual when a car stopped and 3 men alighted and proceeded inside the headquarters. I didn't really pay any attention. The gentlemen weren't.
Mr. Baldwin, again, if we can, in a narrative sense, I don't want to get you ahead of yourself. You were out on the balcony.
That's correct.
Following the general instruction.
That's correct.
Of Mr. McCord to observe anything unusual. Is that correct?
That's correct.
The walkie-talkie was inside the room.
That's correct.
All right. Now, did you hear any conversation? This is prior to the arrival of
no, sir.
Any car or any individuals.
No, sir, I did not.
Did not. Did you observe anything across the way that was unusual?
No, sir.
In the way of lights going on or off?
No, sir.
Did you see any individuals?
I saw lights go on, but I believe it was just at about the same, subsequent to or just around the time of the arrival of the 3 gentlemen. I do remember observing the 3 gentlemen leave the car and go into the building.
All right, now pick it up from there. In other words, there were no observations up until the point in time when this car arrives and 3 individuals get out. Is that correct?
The first thing that really struck in my mind was the 8th floor of the building. The lights went on the entire 8th floor. And when the lights went on of the 8th floor, I went inside and I picked up the walkie-talkie And not knowing whether to say Unit 1 or Base 1 or how to call, I just picked up the walkie-talkie, and I believe I used both designations, Unit 1, or I might have even said headquarters. I might have said Base 1 to any unit. Do you read me? And then a voice came on it back. I read you, go ahead, what have you got? And I said, the lights just went on the entire 8th floor. He said, oh, we know about that. That's the 2 o'clock guard check. I said, okay. And they said, all right, let us know if anything else happens. I put the walkie-talkie down and I proceeded out on the balcony again. I noticed the lights flicker on the 6th floor of the Democratic National Headquarters to the extreme right. They just went on briefly and went off. I went back inside, picked up the walkie-talkie, and as I was standing in the doorway when I observed these individuals coming out on the balcony of the Democratic National Committee.
Which individuals are you referring to?
There were 2 individuals. Do you want me to describe them?
I want you to describe to the committee what you saw that night.
One individual had on what I would call a windbreaker that appeared to have a university emblem and a university written across his one of the chest area. The other individual had a weapon out, and they were both of them were casually dressed. And one individual sort of had long blonde hair, a stocky built individual. As I observed them, I called over the unit again, Base 1 or Unit 1. Are our people in suits or are they dressed casually? And the call came back, our people are dressed in suits, why? And I said, well, you've got some trouble because there's some individuals out here that are dressed casually and they've got their guns out. And the guy on the other end went a little bit frantic.
Well, all right. Now
I put the walkie-talkie down and he continued to yell over it, are you reading us? Are you getting us? Come in, hello, anybody there? Well, I knew he wasn't calling me. So I went out on the balcony and I just stood there and watched these individuals as they proceeded to search the balcony. A third individual had also come into the office area, turned the lights on, and was searching in that office area. So there were 3 now on the scene searching.
were you able to observe anyone else on the street below?
I don't directly recall at that specific point, Senator, of time right then.
Why don't you continue your narrative then?
Well, the individuals then went into the office and proceeded to the left of the building, and as they passed through, the corridor light was on, and as they passed by various office doors, eventually they went out of sight, and I didn't see them. I believe it was about this time that a voice came over the unit that said, they've got us, a whisper, something like, they've got us, and then what I believe was Mr. McCord's voice in the distance saying, are you gentlemen Metropolitan Police, or something to that effect. And then another voice came on, he said, are you still across the street? And I thought, if somebody's listening, you know, I didn't know what was going on. I just said, yes, I am. They said, well, we'll be right over. Subsequent to that, I saw two individuals walking out between the Watergate building directly across and the one closest to the Capitol building here. They came out an alleyway.
Can you identify those two individuals?
One of the gentlemen looked up at me. I was still on the balcony. He was just looking at me. That was Mr. Hunt, the other individual. He was dressed in a windbreaker, sort of windbreaker, and I believe a casual shirt. The other gentleman was dressed in a suit, and from my observation, he didn't look up, but I had the belief it was Mr. Liddy.
All right. Did you see Mr. Hunt go over to the Howard Johnson's motel?
No, they walked up in front of this far complex, almost directly in front of that lobby, got into a car and proceeded up the street. And as soon as they were in the car, another voice came over the walkway and said, I'm on my way. And approximately 2 or 3 minutes later, Mr. Hunt came into the room.
All right. Mr. Hunt came into the room. Would you describe Mr. Hunt's entry into the room?
Everything?
Everything.
Well, he proceeded over, and I was standing there in the balcony area, and he crouched down behind a table. He said, what's going on? What's going on? And just about this time, they were leading Mr. McCord and the other gentleman out of the front of the lobby, and there were all kinds of police cars there. And I was standing on the balcony. I said, well, come on out. See? And he said, I got to use the bathroom. And He went into the bathroom and he came out and he said, I've got to call a lawyer. Where's your phone? And I said, it's right there. And he went over and he dialed a direct dial number, because in the motel room, when you want to place a long-distance call, you have to go through the desk. So he dialed 8, as I would do when I dialed a local number, and he dialed a direct dial number, and he proceeded to talk. I paid no attention to the conversation. I went back on the balcony and continued to watch. I did hear him state that I've got $5,000 cash on me now for bond or bail if we need it. And then something to the effect, will you go right down, or should I go down? And I don't remember. That was it. He then proceeded to give me instructions what to do with the equipment.
And what were those instructions?
Well, he removed a walkie-talkie, put it on the bed, and he told me to pack up everything. I believe his expression was, get it the hell out of here. Get yourself the hell out of here. Go somewhere. Where are you gonna go? I said, well, I can go to Connecticut. And he said, well, go. And he said, we'll be in touch. You'll get further instructions.
Now,
he said, I want you to take all this equipment to Mr. McCord's house. And I had a little debate with him about that, because I said, well, there's 2 of you, and there's only 1 of me. Why can't you drive it and somebody can drive you back? If I get out there, I have no way to get back. He said, Mrs. McCord or somebody will drive you back. You work that out. And he proceeded to go out the door, and he went down to the elevator.
But now, he went out the door, and was he running down the hall or
yes,
walking?
Yes, he was. No, he was departing.
And did you say anything to him as he went running down the hall?
Yes, I did.
What did you say to him?
I asked him if this meant I wasn't going to Miami.
Now, Mr. Baldwin, did you accidentally, in the course of cleaning up the room, did you accidentally pick up certain memos from Mr. McCord's bag? And if so, could you describe the nature of those memos? That's correct. After I was given the instructions to pack up everything and get out, which meant putting all the electronic equipment away, Mr. McCord's briefcase was open. He had left his wallet. I didn't see him leave his wallet. He had put his wallet, all his change, his car keys, all his personal effects were on the bed. I proceeded to put those inside his briefcase, inside his briefcase, attaché case. And then I proceeded to collect all of the logs, not the logs of, I believe there was one, might have been one call that day that was still in the room on the log sheet. And I put that with all the yellow pad into his briefcase. And at the time I did, I took everything off of the table area that was the work area. And along with that went a insurance book that had the dates in it and different, that I had been keeping for myself. And I threw all that material into Mr. McCord's briefcase. And when I realized I had put my own personal notebook in there and the yellow pad, I proceeded to remove those. And I didn't stop to separate the papers. I just threw them into my attaché case. And when I arrived back at Connecticut, I had some memorandum that belonged to Mr. McCord. I immediately wrote him a letter telling him that. Do you still have these memorandum? That's correct. I have those memorandum. All right. Would you care to turn those over to the committee at this time? Mr. Chairman, these are memoranda, I would say, in most instances, a rather routine nature. By way of identification, just in order that nobody feels that anything is being kept from them by this committee, I would identify them as follows, and the originals are now being given to the committee.
Would you like to have them marked?
And I would very much like to have them marked for identification and numbered as exhibits. There are two memoranda which are personnel reports on individuals who had made application to work at the committee to re-elect the president. There is further a memorandum which is on committee for the re-election of the president heading. It is to Mr. Robert Odle from James McCord. And it describes or relates to security at the Republican convention. Then also there's a group of papers. Which I would best describe as relating to Jack Anderson. The memorandum, the top memorandum, is confidential subject Jack Anderson, and it's signed James McCord. This group of papers relates to Mr. Anderson. Again, to repeat, Mr. Baldwin, recently there have been suggestions that you were a double agent working for the Democrats. I want you to describe to this committee, first of all, any incidents that may have led to such comments being made.
Well, I believe the number one incident may be the fact that I was not a defendant in the criminal action that preceded this incident. There have also been incidents in the paper that Mrs. Mitchell has attributed to the fact that I had stated to her on different occasions that I was a Democrat.
What is your...
I do have Democratic friends. I wouldn't deny that, but I have been a registered Republican since I've been old enough to vote, so I don't know if that makes any difference. And at the time of the trial, the criminal trial I'm speaking of the defendants, during the course of the days that we were roomed at the United States Attorney's Office, the conversation was initiated on several occasions by one or two of the detectives that the only way I could have gotten away was the fact that I was a double agent. There was some kidding back and forth amongst the police officers, and that, to the best of my knowledge, is the only indication that I have of, and other than the fact I've heard statements made by different individuals that I was a double agent on television and in the newspaper.
Was there not one additional incident which actually came to the attention of Mr. McCord?
I believe, Senator, are you referring to during the course of my employment in Washington where I had a date with an individual, a young lady that happened to work for the for an official of the Democratic Party? I don't believe that would have led Mr. McCord to believe I was a double agent. As a matter of fact, he wanted me to exploit that and to obtain all the information I could obtain from her, and I kind of refused to go along with that.
But just so that your entire story is set on the record, Mr. Baldwin, it is true that you were with a young lady who was in the employ of an official of the Democratic Party. Is that correct?
Well, she was in the employment of an attorney who had an affiliation with a Democratic Party organization in the Washington, D.C. area. I don't mean to imply that he was an official working at the Democratic National Committee offices. No, he had a law office in the Washington, D.C. area, and she worked for him. She was going to the convention for the Democratic Party in Miami. She told me that and thought we might see each other down there.
Right. But in other words, these are the only three incidents that you can bring to mind that might have given rise to any speculation as to your being a double agent in this matter. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, would you state would you please go ahead and state to the committee your own feelings on this matter? Have you received at any time any payment of promise, any promise of payment, any income from anyone associated with the Democratic Party?
Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, I have 3 weeks of pay from the Republican committee that I haven't been paid for either.
And lastly, Mr. Baldwin, would you just give the committee a very brief description of your professional background prior to being employed by the committee to re-elect the president? Specifically, did you work for the Federal Bureau of Investigation?
That's correct. I graduated from Fairfield University in 1957. I entered the United States Marine Corps. I was a member of the Marine Corps Reserve with the rank of captain. I'm no longer a member of the reserve. I then entered law school in 1960. Upon graduation from law school, I entered the Federal Bureau of Investigation as a special agent. I resigned from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I worked for the circuit court system in the state of Connecticut, and at the same time, I was also an instructor in police science at a local university.
All right. Now, you've testified here today that you took an active role in what you must have known was an illegal phone tap and a break-in. And as you just stated, you're a former FBI agent, graduate of law school, employee of various law enforcement agencies, and my final question is, why did you, with this type of background, take part in such activities?
Well, with this background, Senator, I have been in organizations where I've always taken orders. I didn't question the legality of the operation because of several factors. I had come down from Connecticut to work for the committee to re-elect the president, and that was the president's organization as far as I was concerned. Mr. Mitchell was heading the organization. Every individual that I was introduced to or that was pointed out to me, I was advised, this is a White House consultant, this is a White House aide. They're on loan. As soon as the election's over in November, they go back to the White House. Al, if we do a good job here, my sole goal was to obtain permanent employment. And Mr. McCord had been, I knew that he was an ex-FBI agent. They had been in the CIA. Based on the credentials of all these people, I didn't question, possibly that was a wrong assumption on my part, not to have questioned, but I didn't, the legality. I've been asked if it entered my mind whether I thought it was illegal. I realize that there are wiretaps that are illegal, but I also realize that under certain conditions, such a wiretap can be ordered or authorized by specific individuals. And I felt that I was in no position to question John Mitchell or anyone else under his command, including Mr. McCord.
But it's also true, Mr. Baldwin, that you never received any direct order from John Mitchell, is it not? Relative to that phone tap operation?
Other than the references to Mr. Mitchell, if I was involved in any difficulty establishing my authority for being in a certain place, or the fact of the weapon, I was to mention John Mitchell.
With the exception of the time when you took the trip to Chicago and Westchester, or rather to Detroit and Westchester County with Mrs. Mitchell, you received all your orders from Mr. McCord, is that not?
That's correct.
Is that not correct?
That's correct.
And now, just to finish up on the time sequence, you left the Howard Johnsons on the early morning of the 17th of June, is that correct?
That's correct.
And where did you go to from the Howard Johnsons?
I proceeded to Connecticut.
Did you first go to the McCord home?
Oh, I assumed, Senator, you had covered the fact that I had delivered the items of equipment to Mr. McCord's home. Mrs. McCord drove me back to Washington. I then took my own personal car and returned to Connecticut.
You typewrote a summary of the conversations you overheard.
Well, they weren't exactly a summary. I would say they were almost verbatim, Senator.
Almost verbatim, and then you gave them to, and the names of the people that, who, as far as you could identify them, they were using the phones.
Well, that's correct. Initially, it was very hard to establish names, maybe the first day or two, but subsequent to that, you see, the problem was I had never worked one of the units before, and then after Mr. McCord instructed me on how to operate it, I could tune it so that the minute the call was either going out or coming in, I would then be in on the beginning. But prior to that, I would receive the little indication on the scope, and I'd be into the conversation, so I don't know who they asked for or who was calling out. But eventually, that was corrected.
And then you gave all of the typewritten transcriptions of what you heard to Mr. McCord, except on the one occasion you mentioned.
That's correct,
You
Senator.
didn't keep any carbon copies or anything.
No, Mr. McCord had the onion skins, and they were still in his briefcase the night I locked it.
Mr. Baldwin,
Yes, sir.
It's 10 minutes after 5 in the afternoon, and rather than proceed much further with the questioning, I'm going to ask you a question or so on, or rather a few questions about a topic or so. Counsel and other members of the committee necessarily will defer their questioning to later, so I assume you're agreeable to returning at the committee's pleasure to answer questions.
That's right.
You're the first witness we've had in a long time who's been able to smile. On the night in question, the morning of June 17th, 1972, when you were standing on the balcony of Howard Johnson's, you testified that you saw the lights come on the 8th floor. You saw 2 men on the balcony of the 6th floor. You called on your walkie-talkie on the second occasion and said, "Are your men dressed casually?" Someone replied, "No, they're dressed in business suits." You know who you were talking to?
No, I didn't, Senator.
Who had you been talking to previously inside the DNC?
With the walkie-talkie? Well, I hadn't used the walkie-talkie with anybody. Mr. McCord had the walkie-talkie at all times, as I say, just prior to him going across the street.
Could you distinguish by the quality of the transmission who you were talking to? Did you recognize a voice?
McCord's voice I could recognize. Are you gentlemen Metropolitan Police? To that effect.
Do you know the officers who arrested the...
I didn't at the time. I do now.
Had you ever known any of them before?
No, sir. I had, as during the course of the trial, we communicated, Mr. Schaffner and I had observed each other at several of the demonstrations, I believe. Now, I remember observing him, and I think he remembers observing me. We were both using the same phone to call in.
What do you mean you were using the same phone to call in?
Well, you have to make reports every 2 or 3 hours, and Mr. McCord wanted activity reports, whether or not any groups were moving or what groups were there and who was there. And several times I was the only one there.
Are you speaking about Mr. Schaffler using the same phone?
No, at the day of the Capitol demonstrations, and I believe before the march to the Capitol, there were several days of preparation for the march, and there was gatherings around the Washington Monument, several campsites set out. And I think we crossed paths on several occasions because both of us were dressed in fatigue jackets, and we sort of remembered each other. And he finally said, "Oh, now I know who you were."
Did you recognize him on the balcony of
the night? No. He was the gentleman that, you see, when, at a subsequent date, I learned it was Sergeant Leeper, I believe, sort of stood, when he came out, stood there and observed Mr. Schaffner, Detective Schaffner. He was a gentleman that was proceeding along the balcony in a rather dangerous situation. So he was more or less looking around the side of the building, and he had a flashlight up, but I couldn't say for a fact at that time that it was the same man. We didn't realize this until we were at the trial, that we had been in demonstrations after we got talking together.
Mr. Baldwin, the hour's late, and I have other questions, as Senator Weicker probably does, and the chairman, but I'm going to stop now with your assurance already given that you'll return if and when we need you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much.